Obviously, Women in Leadership was a pretty landmark achievement for us, not just, I think, in terms of what it's done for our organisation in terms of changing the energy and changing the conversation and the diversity of thought that we have here in the organisation, but also about setting the scene. One of the things that I get quite frustrated with across corporate Australia is that they set a target of 40%. And they kind of say, oh, that's just the standard target. And I think, well, it's not standard, it's substandard. And obviously it depends on industry, but it's like put 50% somewhere because 50% of our population are female. And I think what it gives us a really great platform to do is to be able to change the conversation and to change the dialogue. And whilst not mutually exclusive, the fact that we have achieved such a significant target means that we can actually continue our focus on diversity groups and continue our focus on how do we create a more inclusive environment for everyone. And I think, changing the actual makeup of our senior leadership enables us to do that. And so for us to start thinking more about diversity of thought, how does that drive innovation? How do we get diversity in our problem solving? And for us, particularly around cultural diversity, targets are pretty challenging in terms of how people identify their cultural background, particularly in this country. But I think it's absolutely something that we need to have a think about and we need to turn our attention to, probably not so much around the end game in terms of a target, but how do we put, one of the things that we learnt from Women in Leadership was we need to hardwire some stuff and we need to change the culture around other stuff.
And on that, Women in Leadership has been a long journey to some extent, and a lot of organisations are still on that path. So I guess maybe the next question, Lynn. You've obviously been a great advocate and key for Westpac in that field as well. To Sam's point, what are some of the key learnings that we get out of the Women in Leadership that we can apply in the cultural sense?
Well, I think part of the success of Women in Leadership and actually gender diversity leadership teams I've been part of for a long time now have been setting of targets, actually, and particularly in banking, because in banking we're quite numerate type people, and what tends to happen is if you set a target, you put it in somebody's KPIs, people work out how do they get there. And they start to track through, okay, what's the pipeline, how many grads am I hiring in, how do I change that interviewing process if I'm not getting enough, say in that respect, so I'll talk about gender, if I'm not getting enough women in, next rank of management, what's happening here, are people dropping out, why are they dropping out, what are the ages, what are the reasons, can I look at all those reasons, if I have open jobs, how about I make sure, which is what we've made sure, that there's always a female on the short list. You always make sure there's a woman on the list, but a female on the short list. And I, for example, have a very, very good friend who's been in headhunting, senior headhunting for a long time in one of the big recruitment firms. And she started a few years ago by making it her business to try to make sure where all the senior women were in banking. And people thought she was wasting her time. And of course now that is what everybody's doing, and she's become at the forefront of her field. And it's because it became what people talked about, what people thought were important, put it into their targets. And we started to realise that every time we talked about an open job, we needed to have the names of potential female candidates there as well as male candidates. And you keep tracking it through, and you look at what interventions need to be in place at various times to stop people dropping out of the process. And in that case, it was to stop women dropping out of the process. So even to the extent of having, take a look at your lending practices for maternity leave people, take a look at if women are away. And by the way, a lot of men take time off too with young kids. I'm noticing that's an increasing trend, which is really great to see. But if women are taking time off with young babies, sometimes having morning teas, bringing them in to make them feel included again and being part of the situation. So we put in place a lot of interventions, and that was because we had a target. We had a goal we wanted to get to. And like any part of business, we said, okay, right, how are we going to get that? How are we going to grow that part of our business? Let's set about, methodically working our way through what's required. So that has been, and there's been lots, setting up creches, setting up all sorts of interventions to get there. Mm-hmm. And in this organisation, of course, it's been groundbreaking. Mm-hmm. First bank with paid maternity leave, first bank that had a female teller, first bank that had a female branch manager, female general manager, group CEO. You know, fantastic credentials that have gone on for a very long time. So we've got those credentials. So what we need to do is, having done it successfully there, is move it into, you know, the cultural diversity area.
In my mind, you want to understand, well, what is the percentage of the population that's of a particular cultural background, and then you want to understand what is the distribution within your organisation. And so if there is a gap, to my mind, then the task ahead is to actually work out, well, how do you close the gap? And that takes into that needs to take into account, well, why is the gap, and what are all the different drivers of that, which Lynn mentioned, in terms of the kind of investigation that you need to do, or the kinds of analysis that you need to do. But I think that's really the task at hand, which is trying to close that gap, but also understanding why that gap exists.
And I think, you know, we've got the data. You know, Your Voice tells us that we know that we have an amazing cohort of diverse cultural backgrounds at our GM4 and our GM3 level. And then when you start, you know, getting up to GM2, GM1 and GM level, that those numbers go from 2 digits to 1 digit. So we know that we've got a lot of work to do. We know that we've got the data. We've got that data via business unit. And so I think it's going to be a really exciting next year for us in terms of, you know, the programs that we're going to pilot and the discussions that we're going to have with the various business units around, this is what your business looks like at this level. What do you want it to look like at this level?
Milestone we made with the 50%, so that's really great. We're market leading in that. How are we comparing to other organisations in terms of the cultural diversity targets?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of Australian organisations, and when I first came into this role, it was one of the challenges that I had was, where do I look to for best practice, to be really honest. And when I look at the States and when I look at the UK, there's some quite significant nuances in terms of how they measure cultural diversity. For example, the States talk about race. We don't talk about race, we talk about cultural background or cultural heritage. So the targets that I know of, and I've done a little bit of a sniffing around, is that PwC have set, the target that they've set is that 20% of their partners will be culturally diverse by 2020. So that's really their top layer, probably their equivalent of GMs, I would say, here. And CBA have also, they've set a bit of a wishy-washy target, to be honest, and it's that their senior leadership will represent Australian society's cultural diversity by 2020. What does that mean? So I think that 28%. Well, I mean, but that they can then, you know. So I think when we do this, we need to be really clear about what it is. And the same with women in leadership. It needs to be challenging but yet achievable. And I think the most important thing, the lesson that we've learned, that Lynn alluded to, is it's a whole of system approach. So it's not just about setting a target. It's about helping each business unit to get there. And some of the things are small things. So there are events like these. You know, some of the things are, you know, pretty significant things, like how do we measure our talent? How do we map our talent? You know, that kind of stuff. So that whole of system approach. So they're the kind of the main two in the Australian landscape. Certainly the States have set different targets, but it's probably not that relevant.
I was astonished. I think it was about 8 years ago, and the numbers of women on boards were like in the single digits. Now it has grown quite a lot, and for new roles when there's turnover, there's a lot more women that get up there. There's a few that are getting there on the cultural side, particularly people who've got offshore businesses, but it's still quite behind, and I'm afraid there are still a bunch of companies that don't even have women at all on the boards, let alone cultural background. So I think it's still getting there, and it's a bit of a, you know, we talked about meritocracy before. You still hear some chairmen say, well, I only want somebody who's been a CEO before, and then if you've got it really hard in the pipeline for women to get up to be CEOs, then that makes it tough to take the next leap. However, I think that the numbers have improved. We've just got more to go.
The US Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation is probably one of the biggest companies that you haven't heard of. We do settlement clearing across the US markets, and if you haven't heard of us, you should see the movie that has Robert De Niro. It's out at the moment, The Wizard. There's a point in the story where the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, are saying they were that close to actually finding out that it was there was something fraudulent going on, and the piece of evidence is where Bernie's asked and confronted about some of the training that he's not actually been doing, but he's been pretending to do all this time over 15, 20 years. And he's asked, like, what's your DTCC account number? And that's literally the piece of evidence that the SEC didn't actually pursue. And so that's the role that one of the roles that our company plays globally, but particularly in the US market. So we're the depository for all equities in the US market, and we've branched out into other areas. And so I, for example, look after a commercial business across Asia Pacific, and that's the trade processing business. And so in Asia Pacific, our business is around $70 million US dollars. No one actually wakes up when they're a teenager and says, "Oh, I want to work for a depository," as much as you want to have those words come out of the lips of Robert De Niro. And I have had a very varied past, but there's a thread to it. And I think there is some themes around the cultural theme and my experience of that, perhaps in different flavours in different organisations. So I started as an engineer. My first role was in consulting engineering, and it was in an organisation where it was very technical, very technically oriented, and there was a gap between the line management, who tended to be very Anglo. They might have been from a British background, they might have been from an Anglo-Australian background, and yet a lot of the engineers doing the work were actually often quite new migrants. And it was interesting because you would find that the managers would be the ones talking to the clients, and much more comfortable with that. And perhaps clients were more comfortable with that as well, and yet the people doing all of the analysis were actually from different backgrounds, Bangladeshi, Asian, and so on. So that was my first experience of working after university. I then actually decided I didn't want to be an engineer at that point, and decided that I wanted to join the Australian Public Service. I went down to Canberra, which I think is one of the widest cities I've ever lived in. And in the public service, I actually can't think at the time of any secretaries, departmental secretaries that were not white, at least in the kind of sphere that I was in. So I was in the Department of Finance, and I think that was also reflected in just the general population in Canberra. It was reflected in the graduate intake. Just the culture there. I still remember one of the advertisements on television at the time. This is like around 2000, and the slogan for one of the restaurants was, "It's not too spicy." Whereas I found since that I think that's changed. So in terms of the graduate intakes, I'm actually seeing a lot more focus on diversity. So I think that is actually changing.
Case, there's always going to be some, critics or cynics as well, over time. I guess, from your lens, like, what are some of the other bottlenecks that we need to confront and deal to, and how do we overcome that?
Yeah. Look, I guess, I'm not going to be telling anyone in the audience anything that they don't know, I think, with this, and the obvious one is bias. I'm at the point, I think, both in my career and also just, I think, Westpac as a group, in that, unconscious bias is one thing, but, I think we've had enough education and enough awareness now that a lot of the time bias is conscious. And so I think we need to, one of my big beliefs around this kind of stuff is, our employee action groups are just so incredibly pivotal to making a difference in this organisation. And whilst that might sound quite cliched, I think they have a twofold, benefit, in the sense that not only do they give people a safe space to find like-minded people and to group together, but from my perspective, and I certainly know from our execs' perspective, they give our people a voice, and they give our people a voice to listen to. So I think in terms of bottlenecks, like, the biggest bottleneck for me always is just lack of awareness and lack of education. I'm a big believer in metrics, having sort of, that's very much my background, but I think I'm a big believer in measuring the metrics, but I think, we know that we have a diverse workforce. We know that, when you look around at our 200 events, they were just such amazing events because we had such diversity in the rooms, in the spaces that we filled. So we don't have a diversity issue. We have an inclusion and we have a development issue, I think. And so I think in terms of bottlenecks, it's about how some of the structural stuff that we have in place. But I also think just, getting away from that mentality of you know, this is the way that I always hire, or this is the way that I always track my pipeline. And, you know, Lynn will have come across this in her business as well. I just can't find a woman to put on a shortlist. And I think both of our responses to that is, well, maybe just look harder.
We're asking organisations to be a little bit uncomfortable. We're asking organisations to do things that are not quite what they used to do. But equally, I think there's two sides to the coin. And as an individual, you owe it to yourself to make yourself a little bit uncomfortable. And that means, you know, putting yourself out there for certain things, and not just assuming I'm not very good at this, or listening to all those voices that you may have heard in your family, all those voices that you had at school telling you what you were going to be and what you would end up doing. And sometimes you really do have to push yourself out there and be a little bit uncomfortable and see what it's like. And you may well find that actually I'm actually better than some of these people at doing this, even though I was always never thought to be the kind of person that could do that.
Earlier as a catalyst for change, and quotas for women, well, you can look at someone and you can tell their gender, so it's quite obvious. What advice would you give to a candidate who perhaps might want to consider something in looking at applying something that's a quota but may not necessarily fit the mould? Now you alluded earlier, Matt, about a mixed background. English is not my first language. I grew up in a household that we didn't speak English. We didn't have the same cultural background. So I guess I would feel like a bit of a fraud, given how I look and talk and that sort of thing, about applying for something in a quota space that's called cultural diversity. What advice would you have for someone like me? And I think it's really important, that point that you talked about, your American colleagues would take it at face value. Having worked for American companies in the same way, yeah, absolutely. So how do I get over myself?
If I can start, I guess my first piece of advice was probably you got to read the organisation, and in some organisations people go, that guy's having a laugh and he's not taking it seriously. In other organisations, your reading might be, no, it's probably important that I do apply, because I think it's important to have the conversation. What are you trying to achieve with the quota? Why are you trying to focus on this particular group, and what are you trying to achieve out of that? Because maybe out of that conversation there might be a realisation that actually we can achieve some of if our targets or our objectives are around broader diversity, maybe you are the right candidate.
My advice would be is if that is part of you, if that's part of your identity, then I think probably wear that with pride. If that's part of who you are and that's what you believe that you bring to the table, then absolutely I would disclose that this is my cultural heritage. And I think Matt's right, like obviously you've got to read the situation.
Yep.
And I think, but also to not let that hold you back, in the sense that if this is the role, if this is the space or whatever happens to be that you want to play in, that you play in that as your authentic self, and then it's up to us to create the environment, I think, to support you.
You raise a great issue, because we've wrestled in the past and haven't actually landed it as to how we actually measure the cultural background. Because, and equally I'd do it the other way. I used to work with a guy who came from an Indian family, but he's like third generation Australian. So he doesn't consider himself to be Indian, he considers himself to be Australian. And he says, why would you consider me to be diverse on your team? I've had the same upbringing you have. Well, he hasn't quite had the same upbringing, because he's probably been in a family where, they've got different traditions in the way, or even Gladys Berejiklian, the Premier. She's, I think, Armenian background? Armenian background. And that had a real impact on her, that background. You wouldn't guess it seeing her, though. So I think it is absolutely the way you feel about it. And keep in mind, we're not just going to say, oh, great, we've got this guy, quota, boom, here he goes. We'll be looking at, as ever, at the right mix and all that sort of stuff. But you've got to, I actually think that if you look at career trackers, which is another wonderful initiative we've got, I don't know if you know about this, we sponsor a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, and it's an amazing, you spend your half night with tissues all around you listening to the stories of these kids, of how they've got themselves to where they have. You get some pretty white Anglo-Saxon looking looking kids that are in that program, but they identify and they've got that background, and they just go through career trackers. So I think that it's I think you're talking about the right sort of measurement tools there, because it is hard otherwise to identify that, and we would just have to work our way around that, basically.
The fact that we're actually having this conversation right now is in itself a really good thing, and I don't mean this just to say, okay, this is a great positive moment in all our lives or for Westpac in general. It's actually a point in terms of civilization and also humanity itself that Australia and, okay, I'm going to say something a bit controversial, but the West actually has this while the rest of the country, of the world doesn't. We actually have these conversations here. It's something unique to this culture and Europe and everywhere else. So we need to appreciate that for itself. And we need to be proud of that we're right here, right now. And second thing about BT, we do actually have a board that's greater than 50% women, so we've got that as well. And so the question is that I work in client relations, which sees the pipeline, so we see the front as soon as we actually walk in. So I see how many people are coming in, what's the diversity, whether it's men, women, or from a culturally diverse background. I often want to say something, and I do, probably to my detriment, but how can I go about that better? Or should I just leave it to yourselves and your organisation and this organisation to take care of?
So sorry, how do you see them coming in? Just explain to me again.
Because I work on the front line, that's in the pipeline.
Oh, I see. So the pipeline ready to go up.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do I do? And do I say something, or do I keep quiet?
No. Well, I think you should say something. So you should say something to your manager. You've got this opportunity to say it in these sort of forums. But no, you've just got to get that message up there. There's plenty of ways to communicate in this organisation. I mean, you could go straight to Brad. You could go to the leadership team, underneath him. You can go to the HR people, make these No, you don't want to do that.
Me.
Yeah, go to Sam.
Talk to me.
Talk to me. I mean, yeah, this is what we're here for, is to work across the group. So you should raise it. That's what we're trying to create a speak up culture about all sorts of things, not just the problems that there are in financially or whatever's going on, but if this is an issue, please speak up.
Well, it's not an issue. I'm just saying that I get to see what's actually happening at that point.
Yeah, I think it's interesting sort of spending a fair bit of time with GEs in the last sort of 10 months. You do, and even preparing papers for board and talking to some of our board directors, they know that they get a filtered lens of the world. And I think, when someone does speak up and when someone does tell them what they're observing and what they're seeing, my experience is that it's welcomed, because I think we don't, unfortunately, the further up the hierarchy you get, the more filtered information you get. And I think that opportunity to be able to listen to real voices, and I think, look, if you don't feel like, I can guarantee you that Brad would be receptive, but if you personally don't feel like that, talk to me, and we could talk to Brad together, or whatever it happens to be. But I think there's, like Lynn said, there's plenty of channels, and even if you start with me, it's definitely part of the stuff that I want to hear, because it means that I guess one of the things that we're going to do in Lynn's business next year is a bunch of focus groups, and that's really around getting the voice of her people to tell us what's going on. And that's so that we can make change. Our leaders can't make change if they don't hear those stories. And so actually having people come to me unsolicited, to be really honest with you, makes my job easier, because it then means that I've got at least some dialogue to then go and validate it and have some more conversations and talk to those particular. And is this what everyone's seeing and smelling and feeling? What do we do about it? And then we problem solve for it. And I think one of the things I've observed at Westpac in the last couple of years is that when we know about an issue and when we set our sights to actually solve something, we're actually not too bad at it. So